For those of you that attended last year's session on the Monday Musing about natives, this might look a little bit familiar to you, but hopefully this is going to serve as like an introductory refresher as we get into more invasive. So I'm going to kind of set the stage focusing on natives and why they're important. And then we're going to talk about why the invasives are so bad and what we can do to kind of remedy that from a homeowner perspective. And as always, if you have questions, pop them in the chat. I'll get those answered. Or if you have any comments as we move through, things that are maybe confusing, especially when we get to the invasives, there may be some of you that are growing these at home. I've been in a discussion today on mimosa trees with some folks, a post I shared earlier. If you're friends with me, you probably saw that. A lot of people don't realize that's actually an invasive species. So anything like that that you're kind of confused on or, you know, have questions about, want a little bit more detail, pop that in the chat because I can't see all those questions that y'all are popping in the chat right now. Okay, so with that, we'll just go ahead and jump in here. And of course, as with every presentation, I try to give you a little bit of background, and that's kind of how we're going to start out, and just remembering what the word native actually means. And there's a lot of words on here, and I apologize for that, but that way you kind of have it at your fingertips. I like to say when we're landscaping with native plants, it's empowering all of us as gardeners to just care for nature. We're enhancing the local environment, we're adding beauty, we're creating diversity. All of these things are going to leave a lasting legacy for you, especially if you're passing that on down to future generations. Also note there that we're supporting those native pollinators, which can be bees, it can be ants, butterflies, even hummingbirds, and birds would be considered pollinators. Plus, it's just helping us connect with the natural heritage of a region. So often we'll get asked what explicitly defines native. And basically what that is referring to is just being native to a region within decades of actually being introduced to the area. So to be native, they have to originate in the region or even co-evolve with other species over thousands of years. So then as they evolve together, then they're adapting to that environment and everybody's living happily ever after. Everybody is living harmoniously together in nature. So maybe one way to kind of illustrate that is many of you have heard me talk about our native orchids in the Great Smokies or in the National Forest lands. More specifically, the yellow lady slipper or the pink lady slipper. And you've heard me say, number one, don't poach that just from an ethical standpoint. But number two, because of those relationships with the mycorrhizae fungi that is established in the soil. And if we disrupt that relationship, then we're going to bring home a native orchid to our home landscape that probably 9 out of 10 times is not going to survive just because it's going to be lacking in that relationship that is already established in its native home site. Another good way to probably describe that is take, for instance, our eastern redbud, the Cercis canadensis. Well, our Latin tells us it was first discovered in Canada, the canadensis part. So we know that it's going to be a native species to the entire eastern seaboard. And it's a tree that we all know and love. There's a lot of cultural and even religious ties to the tree. But when we are purchasing these natives, even though it's a native tree, we don't want to be purchasing a redbud in New York and bringing it to Tennessee or Georgia or Alabama to plant, even though it's the same tree. We want to purchase those trees where they've been grown and adapted to those natural environments. So just kind of keep that in mind. Even though they're native, we still want to consider the climate, the topography, and its native habitat. And with that, one thing that you've heard me mention too are the nativars, just the native cultivars. This is a big thing now. So we know that, for instance, the monardas and the bee balms, we have so many, or the echinaceas and the monardas rather, we have so many different cultivars and nativars of those. So we can have all kinds of colors, all kinds of different disease resistance built in. So even though maybe the monarda or the Echinacea tennescenensis is our native species, we still have options to provide other color and things like that. So keep that in mind too. Of course, as we move into this, you'll see why some of these invasives are kind of choking out some of our native species and why these are going to be so important. Just as a reminder, when we speak to the word indigenous, that is often used synonymously with native, but neither one of those terms is really going to tell us where specifically that plant is native. So going back to our Echinacea tennescenensis, that's an endemic plant. It's limited to one region. And more specifically, it is endemic to 3 counties here in Middle Tennessee, Lebanon, Tennessee, Middle Tennessee area, Wilson County. And that's they're actually seen growing and endemic specifically to the cedar glades in Tennessee. So they're going to occur just on those specialized soils, which if you've ever been to like this, what is that? Cedars of Lebanon State Park in Wilson County, then you know how diverse that topography and the hydrology there truly is. So just 2 terms to keep in mind. And again, kind of going back to the redbud, just remember that the more local you are in purchasing these native plants, then the higher your success rate is going to be. Do remember when you're planting natives, a little dabble, do you? Many of you probably already experienced this, much like I have. You usually only need 1 plant to really get established because they're so good at reproducing. So just starting with a handful is really going to get you pointed in the right direction. The other beautiful part about natives is that we can share them because, again, they are so prolific in how they do reproduce. Just in terms of wildflowers, and I'm going to be speaking quite a bit about this tomorrow if anybody's in Greenville at the Regenerative Ag Alliance, but I just want to remind you that we often hear the word wildflower used synonymously with native, but that's not always going to be true because it can be just naturalized plants that are not necessarily going to be indigenous to a specific region. So if growing 100% native wildflowers to your areas is important to you, and I know that for many of you that would be, just make sure that you're checking wherever you're purchasing those wildflower seed mixes from, because as you can see there, they'll often have seeds from other parts of the country or even the world. And it's not to say that they won't grow well, it just depends on your philosophy with the natives. So just don't assume, we all know what that means. Before we get too deep into the conversation, I've put this link in here for you. And what this is this is going to be specific to Tennessee, but this is a compilation of all of our nurseries and even box stores, greenhouses and everything across the state, from Memphis to Mountain City, that is telling you where you can purchase these natives. Not every nursery, not every greenhouse or box store is going to sell the same plants. So if you're looking for something in particular, and of course we all know that McMinnville, Tennessee is going to be the nursery capital of the world, but even areas they are not going to necessarily have everything, or one nursery might have this and another has this. So this website compiles all of those together for you to make it a little bit easier, because we all have different likes and dislikes, and we all have different soil conditions. Some of us are maybe living in a swampier area. Some of us may be in a drier site. So all those kind of things are going to be conducive to growing natives, but you might want a little something different, just depending again on your philosophy. And this is embedded throughout on the PowerPoint, and plus I'll have it included in your email this evening or tomorrow. Again, just a reminder that we here in the Southern Appalachians are a non-glaciated area. I like to remind everyone of that because it does, in fact, affect a lot of our flora and fauna species in this area. And when I say Southern Appalachia, I'm talking about from the southwest corner of New York all the way down into Alabama and Mississippi. So that entire stretch would be considered the Southern Appalachian. Now, 2,000, that means that we've got about, give or take, 2,000 species of Appalachian flora in this area. And we know that about 200 are wholly confined to this area in Southern Appalachia. So that's pretty phenomenal. And as a result of that, we are considered one of the great floral provinces of Earth. It's a highly complex interdependent system of plant growth. You've heard me already mention that with our native orchids. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind, because we live in a really cool and diverse area anyway. And we're in an area where we can just really grab hold of natives and really get those to take off in our own landscapes, and they will flourish and adapt and be maintenance free pretty much, which is kind of what I like. But just to remind you of the great floral provinces, one way to remember that is the Rhone Highlands. You go up to Carver's Gap, Rhone High Knob to the right, and Cloudland Hotel. You go left across Grassy Ridge, Jane Bald, and Big Hump, Little Hump Mountains. And we all know that what is known for up there are those Catawba rhododendrons. And they do, in fact, have the Rhododendron Festival every year about the second week of June. So it's something really spectacular to see those plants actually thriving in their native habitat. We're going to speak a little bit more about ferns, mosses, and mushrooms later in the year, but also remember that they too actually can be planted and considered native in our home landscapes as well. And just one more thing about where we do live here in Southern Appalachia. And it goes back to that being a non-glaciated area. It's pretty unique here that we have what we call those cove hardwood forests. So if you've ever been to the chimney top picnic area in Gatlinburg, looking up toward the chimney tops, that little walking trail there is an excellent example of a cove hardwood forest or a deciduous oak forest. There's lots of native flowers and species throughout that trail, including the ferns and the mosses and all that good stuff. Plus all the trees and the shrubs. It's a really good example of that. And then, of course, the coniferous spruce fir forest. Anytime we get over that 5,500 foot in elevation, that's where we're going to see the he balsams and the she balsams really thrive, which makes it, again, a really cool area. So as we get into more of the natives, why they are, in fact, so important and what their role is, one of the biggest, of course, is going to be that they pollinate crops and the natural vegetation. And we all know cucumbers are starting to come in really heavy right now. So some of you may have some issues with cucumbers when they get that little curve on the end of the cucumber and it's kind of soft and you're like, why is it doing that? Well, usually that's lack of pollination. So we want to make sure that we create this biodynamic ecosystem. So we're growing things that's going to lure our pollinators in. You've heard me already mention seed dispersal. They're very prolific in how they reproduce. So that's why a little dab will do you to get started. One of the others I really like about natives, when we really focus on that population, we're balancing production ag with home gardening in relation to pest populations, specifically disease and insects and even weed populations, because we're narrowing that focus. We're bringing it down into a funnel. We're creating a habitat for beneficial insects that are actually going to come in and eat the bad bugs. Whereas we know in a monoculture system, and it's nothing to take away from big ag, we know that's how things are done. But when we have these non-monocultures in our home landscape, then everything thrives and lives together. So again, just a little rundown here. I've already went through a few of those, but one thing or a couple other things to keep in mind is that they are going to help us build soils. They're going to cycle and move nutrients for us. They help purify air and water. They actually will help decompose waste, contribute to climate stability, and help moderate weather extremes, especially flooding and drought. When we have natives on site, then a flood or a dry period is not going to impact them near as much as it would a non-native species. And then number 11 there, protecting our water's edge, which is really critical if you have a creek or a river, or if you even live on the lake shore. And of course, many of you have seen this before, but a lot of our natives, especially here in Southern Appalachia, they tell a story. They're going to evoke a certain sense of nostalgia. And that's one thing. I was just in communication. I'm speaking at the UT Arboretum next week, and we were going back and forth about some of the plants. And she said that she always loved it when her grandfather would send sassafras in the mail, and she loved sassafras tea. And that's what I said to her. I wrote back and I said, bingo, that's what it's all about. These plants tell a story, and it's going to be different for every one of us. And some of you may want to try to recreate that. That's kind of what I've done at home. Everything I have planted came from somewhere. A lot of it came from the farm back home in North Carolina, from friends' homes or whatever. And I can pretty much tell you a story linked to all of those plants. So for many, it might just be narrating your own autobiography. Some of these go back a little bit further. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I've mentioned this before, but just remembering the passion flower, our Tennessee state wildflower. You know, it was Christian missionaries in South America that named this plant. They related it biblically to the death of Jesus Christ in the 16th century, and that story has just prevailed over centuries. Same thing with goldenrod. It gets a bad rap because everybody thinks it's what makes them sneeze in the fall. But in fact, that pollen is too sticky to be carried by wind. So goldenrod is actually an excellent plant to have thriving in your native landscape. And plus it ties its stories back to the Native Americans. It's known as woundwort because it was such a great healer from the Native Americans, and they passed that knowledge on through the years. Same thing with the Cree Indians and the Pipsissewa or the wintergreen. Again, it's all linked to a story. I'm not going to tell a lot of those because it's in the slideshow. But chicory, a huge story there. You know, we know that our ancient philosophers wrote about chicory. It's been inspiring Horace and Virgil for centuries, since the 17th century. And we know that they, in fact, used, or chicory was a inspiration to them for some of these writings. And then as it came on into America, of course, in Louisiana is where it really took off as the chicory coffee. So a lot of stories there as a substitute with no caffeine. And you've heard me mention ramps many times. Ramps have a huge story to tell because they're really huge in this area. Newport used to have a ramp festival. Waynesville used to have a ramp festival over in North Carolina. But this is kind of what was nature's spring tonic to our early settlers in the region. This was the first thing to emerge in the spring. They would drink this and it would help detoxify and purify the blood after a long winter. Same thing with the fiddleheads or the ostrich fern in northern Appalachia. It was the same type thing. This was one of the first things to emerge in the springtime. They would roast them up and use that to detoxify. Tastes very similar to asparagus. And, you know, I get questions all the time on how we know all of this knowledge. So if this is something that interests you, just remember to look up a few folks and reacquaint yourself, especially with William Bartram. We see his stamp on a lot of books, a lot of roadways, highways, trails. The William Bartram Trail we know is kind of straddles the Appalachian Trail for quite a long length in the Smokies. It's all throughout Tennessee and Western North Carolina. But he was America's first native-born botanist. So he believed in documenting everything that he saw. He kept a log of all of this with his travels. A lot of his travels were actually in Florida and up through Alabama into Western North Carolina and Tennessee. And that's what I was saying. A lot of things are named for him because he did, in fact, leave that stamp. And you can see there the National Recreation Trail. So if you're not familiar with Bartram, really, you know, look up some of his work. There's some links in the PowerPoint to that. Another great individual that kind of helped us document this come along a little bit later, and his writings were not quite as good or as well written as Bartram, but that was Andre Micho. I'm not really good in French, can y'all tell that? But at the same time the Declaration of Independence was being written, he was here at Grandfather Mountain singing the French national anthem. Of course, the bridge wasn't there at that time, but a lot of people looked up and respected Micho for his documentation of a lot of the flora. And you can see there, especially at Roan Mountain. And you can again see there the literary talents. He'd probably be a little bit better known today if he had possessed that skill. You'll see here that Micho came to the area, if you're familiar with Lake Jocassee and Kiwi, which is down in that little tri-state area of around Cashers, North Carolina, upstate South Carolina, and then even into Georgia. Both of those are where the Whitewater and the Kiwi River, Horse Pasture River, all those come into play. But that was known actually as, as the land of elderberries. That's actually what Kiwi means. And that's just a little shot there of Whitewater Falls if you've never been. It's something pretty spectacular to see. So I digress for a minute, but I had to share that with you. Another great person that documented, a lot of people didn't really like his work, but if you kind of read in between the lines in regards to plants with those native species, that was Horace Kephart. He wrote a lot about the Great Smoky Mountain area. He was actually from Hazel Creek. So if you're familiar with the Smokies, kind of straddling the AT from Clingman's Dome going south toward Fontana Dam, you had Eagle Creek, Hazel Creek, Forney Creek, and Nolan Creek. So if you've ever seen those, all those tributaries came into Fontana, and all those communities were flooded when they built Fontana Dam. But the whole point of that is that he documented a lot of our Southern culture, and he did it through the voice of the plants. So Our Southern Highlanders is a really good book to consider reading. Like I say, don't read it from what some people would say, the redneck or the hillbilly perspective. Read it from the plants perspective, because there's some really good literary content there. So as we move from natives to invasives, the reason that I wanted to share with you Bartram and Micho and even Horace Kephart is just to say that years ago, when they were in this area documenting plants, some of these plants, well, I think maybe all these plants that we're going to talk about, were nothing that they had documented back during that time. So that's going to kind of provide an illustration now of where and how these plants came into play and why they are such an issue to preserving our native species, not just in the national parks and the national forests, but also in our own personal home landscapes. So when we talk about an invasive, oftentimes you're going to hear that term itself, or you'll hear non-native, or you'll hear alien, or you will hear exotic. Okay, so all of these species, it just kind of depends on who's writing it as to what term that you are going to hear. But oftentimes what occurs is when we think about greenways, stream, side zones, forest, public right-of-ways, anywhere in a natural area that has been disturbed, we're creating a natural environment for these to thrive. And that's what we want to kind of get away from. Because when we look at like the National Forest Service, for instance, their budget, there's a huge budget that has been created to control and manage these invasive species. Even though years ago when they were first introduced, we thought that they were doing a great thing by controlling erosion and this, that, and the other. But now we know that they have in fact kind of taken over the universe. And I'm sure some of you are thinking of one plant in particular right now. But we know in Tennessee, and I've got this table toward the end, and there's some links in there that you can go in and see all these plants. But we've got about 50 species just in Tennessee that have that are posing a threat to natural habitats. And that may not sound like a lot, but it's been in recent years, basically since the 1930s. So they're starting to really cause some major concern. This is just an illustration. Don't really pay much attention to the plants per se, but notice we've got native plants that will replace invasive plants. They're going to look very similar, like the Mahonia, the tall Oregon grape versus Scotch broom. I don't know if some of you are familiar with that. But then even turf grass, sometimes we'll consider that an invasive species because, you know, turf grass didn't really exist way back in the day. So that's one reason you'll hear us mention a lot of times the native grasses like the big blue stem and the Indian grass, switchgrass, and things like that. And we're going to talk about this little devil here. If any of you have this planted, I'm really sorry about that. But another one to kind of make mention of, because I don't know if I have this one in the presentation, but butterfly bush. This is going to go, this is going to be the only place I'm going to talk about the Latin here, y'all. But we know we have butterfly bush and we have butterfly weed, right? So there's a huge difference, but a lot of people use that term synonymously. Well, they're very different. The butterfly bush is actually considered an invasive, and it's on the Tennessee invasive plant list. Now, it's not a rate 1 or a tier 1, it's a tier 2, but nonetheless, as folks are starting to slowly plant butterfly bush rather than our Asclepias or the butterfly weed, these are kind of taking over our natural habitat for the true butterfly weed, which is what the monarchs feed on. So as you're kind of maybe thinking about transitioning, especially if you bought a house and maybe have some of these, and you're trying to eradicate some of this, think about natives to replace that. And in the course of an hour, we don't have a lot of time to go into all of that, of course, tonight. but I provided you a lot of resources. So if you have this plant growing in your landscape, or if you like a certain plant, that you want to plant, make sure you check the native list, because there's something that's going to be comparable to the look, whether it be the structure of that plant, whether it be the color or the bloom of that plant. There'll be something similar that you can plant in that regard. So as we jump into invasive, what is the one that we always think about? Kudzu, right? I saw some of you with your cameras on. I saw your lips moving. Y'all nailed that one. So we all know that this one is considered the vine that ate the South, right? I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. So it was actually brought here in 1876. It wasn't ornamental. And then it was actually planted between the 1930s and 1950s for erosion control. So we do know that, in fact, it works great as an erosion control, right? But the bad thing is that this stuff, how you hear everybody says it grows up to, you can see it growing every day. Well, it does. It grows up to a foot per day, y'all. That's ridiculous. We have seen it actually take over old home sites. Who knows what this right here is? Old cars, buildings, anything. It just eats it up. But the cool thing about kudzu is that it is edible. All parts of the plant are edible. It's just that there apparently is so much of this stuff that we haven't found a good market, I guess, maybe for it. I don't know. But it is creeping. It's a climbing perennial. It absolutely terrorizes native species throughout the South. And we're actually starting to see this move westward and northeast. So it's eventually going to be the vine that ate the entire U.S. If it keeps spreading like this. But this is what I was talking about, especially the reason I chose this picture. You can see the power lines here. When our utility companies go in to maintain these right-of-ways, it costs a fortune, to keep those cleared out, to manage those. And oftentimes that's being done with herbicides, with some pretty stout chemicals. So if you have kudzu, it's really hard to manage and eradicate. It's going to be a process, as with any of these invasives. I'll go ahead and preface that right now as we get into some more of these. So just keep that in the back of your mind. It's not a 1 year, one-time thing that you'll do to eradicate these. Another one I want to speak to, does anybody know what this is? It's kind of a blurry shot, but these are, I saw Linda mouthing that, I think, Bradford pears. They're calorie pears. We know them as Bradford pears, but they, of course, are native to Asia, and they were introduced here in the early 1900s as a rootstock for domesticated pears. So that's how they came to be here. And so that was where the name Bradford pear came from. But if you know me, then you know that I call all these misfits calorie pears, because that is their true name and their true origin. So what happened was, in the 1960s, those Bradfords started being planted pretty prolifically as a street tree and then in home landscapes. But the thing was, when they created this cultivar, they thought it was going to produce sterile seeds. Well, guess what? That didn't happen. So there is a link in the slideshow to this original story, so you can read more. But basically what has happened is that this tree has learned how to hybridize freely. Birds can actually spread the seed. We just get this huge array of calorie pears like you see here in these huge masses, especially in areas of the forest or anywhere, like if we're building home sites and subdivisions. Anything that's been disturbed, these trees just take off. Now, the other bad thing about this is that when they do hybridize freely, oftentimes you're going to see the natural come back with these thorny spikes. So yes, calories in the wild will have those. And also, if you have the domesticated Bradfords in your home landscape, and some of you have heard me tell this story because, how do you learn best? You deal with this crap at home on your own, right? So when I bought my house, I had 3 Bradford pears. It was a little experiment. I was like, I'm just going to let them all come down on their own and let's see how long it takes it. So, I was finally left with a half of a tree about 4 years ago, and it finally came on down. But that was one of the bad things about the Bradford, is that they have these really weak joints. So the bigger they get, the wind will just blow them right down. Many of you have probably experienced that. The other thing is, when you take that tree down, or if it gets blown over by wind, what happens with the tree stump? If any of you have had that, you see them root suckers. They just proliferate, and it's like, where in the world? I am still having root suckers come from a tree stump next to my garden 15 years ago. It's crazy. So you really have to work at these to get them to, probably going to have to use some stout chemical, basically, is what I'm telling you, if you're really going to try to eradicate the calories. Because if you have huge bird populations, then you're going to have an issue with what we just saw on that previous slide. So Bradford pears, not really good. Think about replacing with sarvisberry or dogwoods, anything but a pear. We got to the point that we were replacing those with Cleveland pear, a more upright ornamental. I even say stray away from that. Who knows, eventually they could end up just like this. So really explore some of the native species to replace. And here we go. This is the tree of heaven. This is Alianthus, I think is the Latin name for this. But you can see here, if it's not blooming, which it is here, but if it's not blooming, you would get that confused with many other plants that we think are friendly, right? The black walnut is one that comes to mind. But the bad thing about this tree of heaven is that once it gets started, it kind of looks like a little bush, but it can grow up to about 30, 40 foot tall. But it can send up those root suckers and rhizomes, just like a Bradford pear, up to 50 feet away from the tree. So if you have these, it's going to be really hard to try to get that under control. That's what I'm saying. It's not going to be a one-shot deal. It's something you're going to kind of be fighting with over time. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And we do have some control options that I've attached and that you'll get in the Google Drive as well. But again, you can kind of see what that looks like. If you see this, really try to eradicate it, but realize if you go to certain times of the year, it's going to be better to spray or control this. And right now is that time of year, right before, or right as it's flowering, right up until frost, because it's going to be pushing all of its energy southward into the root system. So this is actually from now until like October, the best time to control. That's where the energy of the plant is going to be most effective. If you get a wet day, you can go out there and pull those root suckers by hand. That's actually very effective with the tree of heaven. A lot of manual labor involved there. Keep that in mind. This is the mimosa tree, or also called the sensitive plant, because if you touch it or raindrops, it closes up almost like a Venus flytrap. It's native to Japan and was actually called the night sleeper for that. A lot of people think that this is a beautiful plant, and even I did as a child. There was one of these growing in my mom's yard when I was growing up. But the wood too from it is pretty weak. And the other bad thing is that it grows so fast. It's a very fast grower. So it's gonna come out earlier than some of our other native trees. So it's going to prevent sunlight from reaching through the canopy, and it's going to smother out some of our smaller understory trees. So that's one of the reasons that it's frowned upon in home landscapes. This is one some of you may recognize. This is autumn olive. I think there's a lot of different names for this depending on what state you're from. And I had some of those in my mind, but I've already forgot them. But the scientific name is Elaeagnus. And we always kind of put a different spin on that word. I'll let y'all use your imagination. But again, it was one that was introduced to us from Asia in 1830. It was actually introduced as a cover for wildlife and erosion control, and you can see why it would be so well adapted and suited for that. But now it has a pretty adverse effect on the nitrogen cycle, is what research has shown us, and that's one of the biggest reasons that it's threatening our native populations. And you can see there, it doesn't have very shiny leaves. It almost has a grayish silver color on the leaf. It is a pretty good browse or berry for wildlife, but it's very dense and it shades out a lot of our other native species. This is what I refer to as Satan's spawn. I don't know if you can see this very good. It looks a little blurry on my end, but this is Geonymous, winter creeper. This is another one that I deal with at my house. It is, it's just not a fun plant to deal with. I have the neighboring property has this all over, and it's just slowly encroaching on me, and it's just a never ending battle, I swear. But it grows as a vine and almost a subshrub. It'll form a really dense mass on the ground, and it just crawls like a carpet. But then it starts growing into trees. Okay, so when they grow into the trees is when they actually will start setting fruit. Okay, and that's where the fruit gets dispersed by birds and everything else. So this one is actually from my house. So it's not quite as bad as English ivy when it sticks to the tree, but you have to give it some oomph to get that off of the tree. And you can see how large that tree is. You can see how large that vine is. It'll wrap around some of those smaller branches and actually just suffocate that tree and really weaken that wood over time. Oh, and I forgot to tell y'all, the Ellie Agnes, a good replacement for that is beautyberry, if you're familiar with that. If you like how that looks, beautyberry is a great one. Calicarpa. Okay, kind of keeping it in the same vein, the heterohelix, kind of, I don't think it's quite as bad as the winter creeper, probably because I don't have it at my house to contend with, but it's going to act a lot like the winter creeper. So when we see heterohelix like this, we're going to have a juvenile form and an adult form. So the juvenile phase is going to be basically on the ground, and then as it grows and starts climbing up things, that's when it becomes into its adult phase. It's going to grow from about 6 to 8 inches tall as a ground cover before it actually takes off and starts growing up and over everything. It's very similar to kudzu, but it can actually reach heights of about 300 foot, y'all. That's insane. It's just crazy. It can actually suffocate conifers. So if you're into the evergreens and have this plant, eradicate it now. But it does have those little root-like structures that when it attaches to something, it's like glue. So if you've ever tried to pull heterohelix or English ivy off of like an old building or up the side of your house, it'll leave its footprints. I don't know if y'all have ever seen that, but it's really hard to unattach it from whatever it's growing on. Here you see the adult phase of that. So you can see very similar to winter creeper. It just takes over the universe. This is one some probably would not consider an invasive. This is the Paulina, or the princess tree. It can reproduce seeds from its root sprouts, very similar to a lot of the other plants that we've talked about. And it can grow up to about 15 foot in a single season. So just in a year, we can reach a pretty standard high. This is another one that was brought to us actually from Europe and Asia in I think it was the 1830s. And it's one that grows, like I say, pretty fast, and it's going to do well even in zones as far south as you, Barbara, zone 6. I mean, it's one that kind of takes off. This is one that you're going to see blooming pretty early in the springtime. The catalpa trees and the Paulina trees are pretty early in the springtime, but you can see how prolific they're going to be at dispersing seed as well. Here is one known as Chinese privet. This is one that was also introduced years ago, and this is not a very good picture to kind of show, but this is actually pretty high, and it's a very dense shrubby undergrowth. So as far as you can kind of see how sunlight would not penetrate that very well to get to the understory. Any small trees, it's just going to shade that out. These thickets like this are going to form. They are actually going to produce massive quantities of food or berries, which is again going to be dispersed by birds, and we're just going to continue that cycle. But this is one that was actually brought to the U.S. and it was cultivated, but it escaped cultivation in the 1930s. But the reason that it's considered an invasive is because it is so forgiving of everything. It doesn't care about its environmental conditions. It doesn't care about soil conditions or water. It just grows everywhere. And like I say, it's good cover for wildlife and for birds, but it is slowly encroaching on a lot of our other native species. This is what it looks like in flower. And then you can see the massive amount of berries that it produces there. Here's one. This is actually the Polygonia, or the Japanese knotweed. And as the name implies, it did come to us from Eastern Asia in the late 1800s. So it's been here a while. It can grow from 3 to 15 foot tall. It's going to have bamboo-like stems, and actually is referred to as Japanese bamboo as from time to time. The bad thing about the knotweed, the reason it's on the tier 1 is because it's creating that monoculture type environment, which is what we're trying to get away from. And it does spread so rapidly. So again, you can kind of see it's growing habit there. It kind of takes over the universe, but you can kind of see what that looks like. And then we have this one. I'm sure many of you know this one. This was always a fun one growing up before I realized that it was slowly becoming invasive. You can actually suck on the honeysuckle part and it tastes like honey. But this is Leesa Japonica. So again, it's coming to us from Japan. It was a very well-established ornamental vine back in the early 1900s. It went all the way up the eastern coast. It's thrived. It adapted itself to a lot of our native habitats. But again, it's one, when it forms that thicket, that really dense shrub, it's going to block out light to all of our slow growing natives. It's going to kill out any other vegetation that it comes into contact with, like you can see here. Now, a lot of people like the yellow color, and some, just like me, it's kind of reminiscent of growing up, you know, honeysuckle was everywhere on the farm. But we do have a native honeysuckle that you can replace that with, which is the coral honeysuckle. Even cross vine, if you like that, or the trumpet creeper. Any of those three vines are going to be really nice and get rid of the Japanese honeysuckle. This is one if you have pasture for livestock or growing hay, or you've probably seen the Multifloor Rose. It gets into the fence rows and it's really tough to eradicate because it's going to be woody. So it's not going to be like a lot of the herbaceous plants when you're spraying fence rows and that kind of thing. But this was actually, again, kind of like the Chicory pear because it was a native, or not a native shrub, but it was a perennial shrub that was introduced, and it was used as a root rose stock for rose breeding programs in the 1930s. And that was when it was so widely planted, especially in the Midwest and the Northeastern states. And then the USDA Soil and Water started saying, you know, this is a really good one for wildlife cover. It's really going to enhance those habitats. And then it was going to serve as a barrier for wildlife coming in to pasture lands. So it was going to, in essence, be a living fence. Well, it has in fact become a living fence, one that most farmers absolutely hate and detest to this day. But again, just to kind of tell you, it was brought in for rootstock to do good, but we know how that works out sometimes. This is going to be bittersweet, specifically the Oriental, because we do have a native bittersweet. So think about our native persimmons, and then you've heard me talk about the Asian persimmons. So it's kind of along those same lines. This is the Oriental type. It's considered a pretty invasive species. You can see there it is a woody plant, so it's going to be really hard to get control of once it does get started. It's going to, and I'm going to show you the leaves here in a minute, but that's really kind of what gives this plant away if it's not bearing fruit, is the glossiness of the leaves. But one reason that people like this was using it for decorations in the fall for both dried and living floral arrangements. But if you're doing that type of thing, again, check into the native bittersweet. But this is what the leaves look like, almost round in shape. Another reason this is on the tier 1 invasive species list is because it's going to be like the Chicory pears and some of those others. It's going to reproduce by even the tiniest sliver of root fragment. So if you've ever tried to dig up and eradicate wild garlic or wild onions in your lawn, you know, if you're not digging up all the little tiny bulblets, they just reproduce by the thousands. So the Oriental bittersweet kind of acts in that same regard. And this is going to be the native here. A lot of people don't like it because it's not quite as glossy. The leaves are not quite as shiny, but it will actually preserve the native habitat much better than the Oriental. Well, you can't really see that one very good, but this is purple loosestrife, and we have a yellow loosestrife as well. Anybody joining us from Chattanooga area or North Georgia, down around Cloudland Canyon State Park, really high populations of the native yellow loosestrife, and it's not an invasive. The purple, however, is, as you can see, the reason it would be considered invasive is just those prolific seed heads. Wildlife, wind, even we as people picking those and dispersing them, they're going to kind of get away from us. And again, much like nutsedge or wild garlic, it's going to reproduce by little pieces of the stem and the root. So triple whammy on this one. If you kind of like that plant, the purple loosestrife is what you see here on the left. A native counterpart would be the blue vervain. You can see how very similar, just a little bit difference in color there, but same type of growing habit. This one here is Japanese stilt grass. It's going to form a really dense stand, as you can see here. It was actually introduced here in the US in the 1920s, I think it was, as a packing material. So packing glass or china or anything breakable like porcelain from China, this is what they would ship it in. So now it's just kind of taken over. You can kind of see the sprawling growth habit. It's going to quickly spread into roadsides, hiking trails, anything like that. It gets a little bit of light and it's just going to take off. If we get a disturbed area, kind of like you see here, it grows pretty prolifically and it's going to be really hard to remove it once established. And you can kind of see there how fibrous that root system is. You can see how many seeds we have going on. So it's going to be spreading again in a multitude of ways. And the bad thing is these seeds, once they drop or once they're dispersed by wind or wildlife, they can persist in the soil for up to 5 to 7 years. So they can just lay there dormant for a while, and then all of a sudden, this is what we end up with. So not a good one to have. One way you can kind of identify stilt grass from some of your other grasses is it's often going to have that little white vein, and you've got that little sharp point. But the growing habit, as dense as it is, that's usually a pretty dead giveaway. Here's one probably many of you, if you forage, you know this one. This is the wild mustard or garlic mustard. So it is edible, but this is one that's not native here. This actually came from Eurasia as well, and it's considered an invasive now. But it does have a lot of herbal and medicinal qualities, so it does get harvested pretty frequently just for that reason. During its first year, when it first sprouts, the mustard leaves are going to be a lot rounder and they take on more of this rosette formation, kind of like you see here. And then as it grows taller is when we get more of this kind of shape in the leaf. So if you ever see it small and it's got those round leaves, it's the same plant. It's just the growing habit, the phase at which it's in. But it'll always have this little cluster of flowers, and they're small, and there's usually 3 of those with 4 flowers per bloom, like you see here. And this is just showing volunteers going out in the forest and trying to eradicate it by hand pulling. If you're familiar with hairy galanzoga, it's going to have a root system very similar to that. I don't know if you can see that right here. It's very fibrous, but it's typically pretty shallow, so easy to hand pull. The biggest thing is that we want to prevent seed development, so we want to be eradicating that right before flower. You can't really see that very good here, but best way to get rid of that obviously is going to be manually. Now, everything that I have just showed you on the invasives are what we call non-native invasive plants as listed by the Tennessee Exotic Pest Plant Council. And they pose a severe threat, which is what we call rank 1 or tier 1 to our natural area. So you've heard me talking about tier 1 several times. So everything that you just saw, plus all of these listed here, are going to be considered a severe threat. So some of those you might have been a little, like, oh my goodness, I've got all those growing in my landscape. And that's one thing we're trying to get away, get people to kind of get away from, like the Bradfords and the winter creepers and some of those things. But you can see there even January jasmine, the bamboo, there's other honeysuckles listed on here. Johnson grass is on that. We all know if we have that come up, it's a what to try to control that as well. I didn't put the Latin on here, but the table that you have attached in the Google Drive, I will share that with you. So again, always refer back to that Latin just to know the differences, because your honeysuckles, remember, the Lana Sarah is going to be for all the honeysuckle, but it's the Japonica is the one that's so bad. Now, we didn't review any plants that are on this one. This is a significant threat tier 2 or rank 2. Okay, so we didn't go over any of these plants. I didn't show you any pictures, but you'll notice and recognize probably several of these, including burning bush. That's also a Geonymous species. The periwinkle, that's a vining plant. That too is on there. The wisteria. There is a difference between the native and the Japanese. We see Canada thistle, the bull thistle, foxtail, all kinds of plants here that many of us are probably familiar with. Even the crown vetch, poison hemlock, we see that growing really prolifically now. So just kind of keep that in mind. Even tall fescue, y'all, is on this list. And the reason is that it's just posing a significant threat because it can encroach and take over natural areas if we don't have any control measures in place. Now, of course, we can't do anything about natural areas that are outside our home landscape and beyond our boundaries. But again, as we get into maybe replacing some of these issues in our home landscape, we want to stay away from some of these plants. There's going to be some liability associated with planting non-native invasive plants, and I've got all this listed in there for you too. Some of these are going to be self-explanatory, just being ethical about it. When you purchase a home, or like, you know, when I sell my home, people are going to be like, did she plant all that winter creeper on purpose just because she wanted it to take over? You know, that's not the case, you know, but as we're slowly maybe replacing some of those, we want to just be ethical in those decisions and recognize what plants Tennessee or your state actually does consider an invasive. When we talk about ecological, some of those liabilities just mean introducing a species that could potentially threaten our natural areas and our forest land. If it's economic, of course, that's just referring to maintaining those rights of ways, like I was talking about a little while ago. And we all know that who ends up paying the price for those type issues, you know, it all comes back to the homeowner's pocket eventually in some form of fashion. And then civil liabilities, of course, you know, a neighbor could sue you for any type of plant that you might plant that's invasive and encroaches on them. So just kind of keep that in mind. Remember that we as people, we are the number one reason that's causing these non-native invasives to come in and encroach. We're indirectly possibly transporting new plants or seeds. And oftentimes when we think about forest disturbances, we as people are actually sometimes often at fault for that, either directly or indirectly. And that just helps facilitate some of those invasive species from taking over. Now, some things, of course, are going to be beyond our control. We know that managed fire, managed burns are actually going to be good for some plant populations because they need that fire for seed dispersal and to continue to thrive in their native habitats. But, you know, sometimes things such as forest fire, maybe forest thinning, if you're logging property or something like that, that can cause a disturbance in the forest. If you have severe storms or any type of severe flooding, we know what kind of problems erosion can lend itself to our stream bank. So that, of course, would disrupt our natural and native habitat. Anytime we get into a drought situation, we have a lot of these invasive species. Just like I was talking about Elaeagnus or the autumn olive, they're just going to flourish in those environments. They're going to take off and grow anywhere. Think about overbrowsing by wildlife. If y'all have deer coming into your property, any kind of overbrowsing can often lend itself to invasive species coming in and kind of taking over. Right of way, I've mentioned that several times. Anytime we have to go in and do construction for that, of course, that's going to disrupt those native habitats. And then even air pollution, if you've been at those elevations higher than 5,500 foot, then you've seen acid rain, or what we refer to often as ozone. Also, you've seen the insect pest damage at those high elevations with woolly adelgids and the southern pine bark beetle. Now you're seeing the emerald ash borer and all its torture. We see the dead ash trees on the horizon oftentimes. So when we get some of those species dying out, then it's given opportunity for some of those like calories and, mimosas to thrive. This is the website I was talking about as far as the Tennessee Invasive Plant Council. There's some how-to videos on this website, y'all, that are just super. They're going to illustrate control methods. It's going to give you some, well, the hack and squirt and the cut stump. That really is truly a thing, y'all. But I didn't go into a lot of detail on these because it's going to depend on the specific plant. So again, for me, I would want to know how to control winter creeper and periwinkle. So, you know, I'm gonna go in there and click on those plants and kind of see what's going to be the best. I know some of you are going to have other issues, even the mimosas or stilt grass and things like that. So you're going to control some of those herbaceous plants a little bit differently. So make sure if you want to eradicate some of these, just number one, recognize it's going to take you a little time to get that under control. And number two, timing is going to be critical. And then of course, number three, just recognizing that you got to have patience to kind of totally eradicate one of these species from your home landscape and get your natives to thrive. If you remember back in March, I think I introduced y'all to the Tennessee Smart Yards website. I'm going to send a link to that website again for y'all tonight. I mean, it would be great if you wanted to become a Tennessee Smart Yard, but if you don't want to go through all of that, there's some really good videos on there that talks about protecting the water's edge and controlling erosion and that type of thing. And there's some tools and resources there that are also going to help you with natives and invasives as well. So you're going to get a lot of additional material. Some of that material has already been put in the Google Drive, and it'll be linked on our Monday Musings web portal tonight or first thing tomorrow, along with the video. So make sure that you check that out, and I'll send you an email with all that information. So if you're not in the Google Drive, don't worry, you'll get a link for that tonight or first thing in the morning. And as always, if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out. We have the Ask Us portal up. We have WhatsApp, and we have a Google Voice number. So multiple ways that you can get in touch with us and ask your questions. And that's what we're here for. So just remember that. And next week, we will be back on Zoom. I think next week is toxic plants. So we're going to get into a little bit more of the lore, some of the plants like the poison hemlock I was talking about a minute ago. We'll talk a little bit more in depth about some of the toxicities of some of these plants, maybe dive a little bit deeper than what we did tonight. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, but also there's about 200 more slides included in tonight's presentation of just plants. So you can go in there and look at all those. You've got a full page slide of many of our native flowers, vines, trees. So make sure you check that out the way they're listed out there. And of course, your resources will also have those pictures as well. So with that, we are going to call it a night. And I guess I will see, I hope many of you next Monday night. Thanks, y'all.